We're going to talk about homelessness in Knoxville, and for our case study, we'll narrow it down to a more specific topic.
So, some statistics on homelessness in Knoxville. We got this from the HMIS system, which is the city of Knoxville's way of tracking homeless individuals. Currently, there are 1,700 homeless individuals in Knoxville. That doesn't include street homelessness, so it's likely more than that. But there's no way of tracking people on the streets. This has risen a lot since COVID, and it's remaining high even post COVID. The city doesn't really know why, but they are tracking it. And then specifically in the shelter in Carm where I work, we've been tracking this independently, and usually both men and women decrease during the summer when the weather is nice, but women have not been decreasing. They've been staying at capacity. So during the winter where we have 200 men and 100 women, and then during the summer where we have like 100 men and then 40 to 60 women, women aren't decreasing to 40 to 60, but staying more at 100, which is usually capacity. And then the reasons for this, why Knoxville has such a high population of homeless individuals, is that we have resources that surrounding cities don't, surrounding towns. And then there's also a housing crisis in the city itself. And then we had a mental health institute close, Lakeshore close a few years ago, that skyrocketed business.
So the reason we both chose this topic is because both of us are passionate for it, probably in different ways. But some of my passion started from just living in Market Square and seeing the need for people needing help and people needing to be loved. And then with that, I was a realtor this year, and in that was able to see the poverty gap between West and East Knoxville, and seeing how horribly difficult it is for people to get housing, rent housing, buy, either way, simply because of a market crash, and how there's just way more resources for people who have access to them, and a lot of people in poverty don't have that. And so
yeah, and then for me, just working at Carm as a care coordinator, my entire job was to connect people to resources, and seeing how difficult it is to connect people to resources when they're experiencing such extreme poverty, was why homelessness started weighing on my heart so much. And then just creating relationships with individuals. We both experienced this, just loving on the people around us just became more and more heartbreaking. And then for this project specifically, we wanted to narrow down the cause of homelessness to specifically looking at drug-related convictions and how they perpetuate homelessness, just because homelessness is such a broad topic and there are many causes for it. So specifically, when it comes to drug-related convictions, the justice system fails to serve people who are struggling with addiction. So instead of helping people seek recovery, they're quick to convict, or the law enforcement will arrest people for drug-related charges instead of helping them find resources that can get them out of their addiction or out of homelessness. And then once convicted, they're getting these lengthy legal records, barring them from housing. The justice system isn't able to treat the problem, just a symptom of it. So that's where the drug-related charges come into play, possession of substances, possession of paraphernalia, and then dealing. And then it takes 7 to 12 years for a housing agency to look over a felony charge, which is an extremely long time for a felony charge to keep someone in homelessness, even if they're seeking recovery. If they've got a felony related to drugs, or an eviction related to drugs, it's going to keep them in homelessness. And then just the lack of recovery programs as well. And without an advocate or insurance or money to pay for it, it's extremely difficult to get into.
And so this year we talked a lot in Mark's class about dehumanization, power, and violence. And this cycle is seen a lot in the homeless population here in Knoxville. First of all, with dehumanization, you can see, I see it myself in the way that I coin people as addicts or homeless people or dealers. There's so many other words that we give them that automatically takes away their dignity and any reason for them to feel welcomed here and as normal people. And then from there, kind of like Annie explained, there's a big power differential in the legal system and their ability to put this hugely impactful charge on someone that will change their ability to ever receive housing, and using their power in that way. And then from there, they can send them to jail, which in and of itself is a form of violence. It also keeps them from finding stability. They're not able to find the help that they need, often leading them to trauma, which can lead them to numbing and violence as a result of that, or having to be in a camp where there's lots of violence seen, especially here. So it just becomes this vicious cycle that they can't get out of. In Kevin's class in Do Justice, we got to talk a lot about the war on drugs, which crack cocaine is a lot cheaper than cocaine, which also becomes a racial issue because African Americans would buy crack cocaine and white Americans often had just plain cocaine, which was more expensive. This meant that most African Americans were caught with it, causing them to have that charge on their record, leading into this horrible cycle that causes poverty and people in jail that don't need to be in jail, that they just need help. So we talked a lot about that in his class. And then we talked about in the Old Testament how similar trends were seen. They just weren't probably coined in the same way. But in Nehemiah 5:4, it says we have to borrow money to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards. And this kind of just shows how it's crazy that back in the day, the same thing was happening as today. And we still haven't found any kind of cure for it, because here at the bottom, you can see it says Senate Bill 1610 would penalize the homeless for solicitation or camping on public property, basically saying we're going to punish you for being homeless when they have no way to get out of it. So there's just no win for people today. So in my field experience, my diagnosis portion of the case study, I was aware of the housing market and the inaccessibility of it. I also got to have relationship with people outside of where we live and got to hear the hearts of people and where they struggle and see the huge issues that go on with people who have good hearts and want a change, but there's just no fix for them and they're just stuck in this system.
And then for me, part of my job is getting people into recovery, and also getting people into housing. And I've had the ability to write on behalf of individuals, persuading housing agencies that they're completing a drug program, a recovery program, or explaining their sobriety journey, just to advocate for someone to get into housing, which is really difficult to prove. And also when the housing agency is looking at months-long waiting list, it's really difficult to advocate for someone in that situation. The treatment that we discussed, if someone gets arrested for a drug-related charge, there should be a mandatory recovery instead of jail time. Jail time is not recovery, and it does not keep someone from using. It also just lengthens the legal record that we talked about before. One other treatment for solving this problem is permanent supportive housing, which the city, it's starting to be worked into Knoxville. It's kind of newer, but it's where they combine housing with case management. So somebody who has experienced homelessness chronically will be able to combine case management with their housing so that they can keep it. It's a way of easing someone into stability rather than throwing them in the deep end. And then also educating people on the language referring to people with it struggling with addiction. This one's big on, we discussed this a lot about this when we talked about dehumanization. Just the language that we use creates the image of someone in our minds. So lowering the stigma around people using our words lessens dehumanization. And then we also talked about the consequences of felonies should have flexibility. If somebody does seek recovery, that should mean something just as much as waiting out the 7 to 12 years. And then just looking into more resources in other towns so that people don't have to be so reliant on Knoxville.
Specifically for me in the future, after having this year and having classes, learning and then experiencing the ways that I want to see treatment in my own life for the homeless population is through hopefully working in a hospital one day and getting to advocate for patients who need health care, who don't have resources to get medical assistance when they need it. Another way I have thought about helping this issue is by staying in real estate and getting to do something like Renaissance Homes does right now, which is where you provide housing for lower income families and you help them flip houses so that they're living in a good house and not something that's going to fall apart on them. And then I think with that, I really want to avoid falling into those stigmas that I can really get caught up in following the people around me and doing. And I really want to build relationships with people despite their financial status or despite whether they have a house or not. I want to stand with people in those areas. And a lot of that comes from loving my neighbor, which is so much of what we talked about in Do Justice, is loving anyone around you, despite who they are, despite who they love, who they serve, how they live. I just want to be a light to people and not take their living situation into account.
And then for me, very similarly, I hope to be an occupational therapist working in the allied health field. And this is somewhere where I would really love to advocate for individuals experiencing homelessness. Often people who are homeless only receive reactive medicine rather than proactive. So this kind of cancels out therapy altogether. And I would really like to close that gap. And this goes for people who are struggling with addiction as well, as there is often a big crossover. I'm also going to be in school and with different clinicians for the rest of my life, and I hope to educate my peers because of the experience that I've had. I don't want to watch the cycle of dehumanization, power, and violence continue. So if I can have the slightest impact by just educating my peers on my experience and leading by example, I think if we all did that, but for me and in my control, my treatment can be impacting my immediate circle.
Thank you.